Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus, which regulars by now will know refers to the mountain in northern Greece where the Greek gods lived, and from which we get the expression Olympian judgments, which is what we try to make in our discussions of history, religion, and culture and why they matter. But of course, it's a foggy day, so we don't really claim to be completely Olympian, but we try.
And today's episode is our third episode in our series on Eastern Catastrophes, and we're calling this one Ukraine in the Jaws of the Soviets. My name is Kawal Campo, and he's Mike Pierce. He just forgot to tell you that.
I did. Well, to get straight into our material then, because I was remembering the material, even if not my name. I'm getting extremely elderly now, as I'm sure you will appreciate. Last time we looked mostly at Poland and how the Polish state was resurrected from the dead after about 130 years or so. And today we're going to be looking just a little sideways at Ukraine and the attempts at a Ukrainian state, which failed, and then at the Ukrainian experience in the early 1930s as part of the Soviet Union. Remembering, of course, that Western Ukraine ended up as part of Poland in the interwar period. So when we're referring to what happens in the 1930s, we're looking simply at Central and Eastern Ukraine, which is part of the Soviet Union.
So we're winding the clock back here a couple of years to pick up the Ukrainian end of the story, right? The stuff we're about to look at overlaps chronologically with what we covered last time in respect of Poland.
Yeah, that's exactly right. At least that's true for the first few minutes when we are looking at these, as I say, attempts at a Ukrainian state. Yes, very much. So we were looking a lot of the time in the last episode at the period immediately as World War I is drawing to an end, and right after that, and we're going to be doing the same thing here for a little bit. Yes. So, here is a map showing the situation in the later stages of World War I. And we have here a kind of Ukrainian state set up under German occupation. World War I finally finishes in November 1918. So, in our picture here, we've got Austro-Hungarian troops entering the Ukrainian city of Kamianets-Podilsky, which had formerly been in the Russian Empire. Austria-Hungary had already encompassed Western Ukraine for a long time. They're pushing further east now because the Russian Empire has collapsed after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in February 1918.
Yeah, and to remind our viewers, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was when the Bolsheviks, they bought off Germany in March of 1918, but with huge territorial concessions.
That's right, yes. They were desperate to extricate themselves from World War I so that they could, because they certainly couldn't defeat the Germans anyway. But they wanted to extricate themselves because they wanted to use all their resources to fight their domestic enemies, who were very many. This is as the Russian Empire is plunging into this horrifyingly bloody and very complicated civil war.
Previous to this treaty, the Russians and the Germans were really sort of enemies, right?
Well, they had been during the war. The Germans, no doubt about it, despised the Bolsheviks. But they had kind of facilitated the Bolshevik takeover. Lenin had been in exile in Zurich, in Switzerland, and they provided him for free transport through Germany in 1917 in a sealed carriage. They didn't want him contaminating Germans with his poisonous communist ideas, and basically made sure that he got onto Russian territory because they wanted him to create the maximum mayhem on the Russian side. They didn't support his revolution, but only insofar as it created chaos in Russia. The Bolsheviks on their side were hopeful that as Germany itself started to come unglued in the later stages of World War I, that communist revolution would spread to Germany as well. And in fact, it very nearly did, but that's another story we can't look at here. Yeah, that's right. So we've got a picture here of Germans in Kiev in 1918. They haven't really had to fight their way there. This is just territory ceded to them. And the next picture shows the same thing. So the first attempt at a Ukrainian state had already happened from the summer of 1917, so before the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and lasted through till April. And this was the regime led mostly by Simon Petliura, and we have a portrait of him here. He had been arrested several times before the war for his Ukrainian nationalist activities in the Russian Empire. What he wanted was a social democratic Ukraine.
Now, social democratic doesn't mean back then what it means now, does it?
No, not really. Nowadays we think of social democrats as being moderately left of centre sort of people who want government intervention, and they're generally a bit fuzzy and cuddly and vague. Back then, social democrat meant basically...
So nothing like you.
Sorry? Just like me, yes, just like me. I'm not a social democrat. Wait. Back then, however, a social democrat meant a Marxist who didn't actually want to kill you. So, quite strident, quite strident. And in 1917, he was prominent in the government of the Ukrainian People's Republic. He would later go on to lead it. We've got a picture here of the first General Secretariat of the Central Rada, the council, that was set up in June 1917. The first, remember, thinking in Russian terms, the first revolution had already happened in Russia that spring. Russia was trying to pursue the war, but the empire was already fragmenting, and these guys had taken their chance for an independent Ukraine. And they're generating their own armed forces. So we've got a picture here of a Sich rifleman from this year. These were one of the first regular military units of the Ukrainian People's Army, and they're formed on a corps of soldiers of the Austro-Hungarian Army.
And almost all of these forces were comprised of men who had just had a fighting experience in the First World War.
Yes. These guys have been in the Austro-Hungarian Army. Others perhaps will have been from Russian forces. I mean, the terrible irony is many of them will have been fighting one another in the service of states that weren't exactly theirs, although those under Austro-Hungarian control, whether Polish or Ukrainian, will have had at least somewhat more affection for the state they were part of. Yeah, that's exactly right. We've got another, I'm afraid, still slightly grainy and non-digitally enhanced picture of Ukrainian Sich riflemen in Kiev in our next picture there. Now, this state did not last very long. Once Brest-Litovsk had happened and the Germans were given control over this area by the Bolsheviks, the German forces came in and simply blew this away. They introduced another Ukrainian state, which we call the Hetmanate, which itself only lasts for the rest of that year, or not even quite that, because, of course, though nobody knew it at the time, Germany was actually about to lose the war. And this was led by Pavlo Skoropadsky. We have a portrait of him here. This one is, as you can see, colorized and digitally enhanced. He'd been a successful general in the Russian army. He had Cossack heritage. He was a very determined opponent of the Bolsheviks, although he wasn't a great fan of Ukrainian nationalism either. So he was an aristocrat, as we've said, a successful general. The occupying Germans facilitated a coup against the incompetent, but still mostly anti-Bolshevik Ukrainian People's Republic. They installed Skoropadsky as hetman. And his regime is not social democratic, it is conservative. It's sort of future in which Ukraine would be federated to a restored Russian Empire.
So he sounds like basically a supporter of the whites who just happened to be in Ukraine and in German hands.
Yes, basically that's it. He's what you would expect from an aristocrat within the Russian Empire. He's not very interested in non-Russian nationalisms. He certainly doesn't want the Bolsheviks, and he's having to come to terms with the fact that Tsarism is unlikely to be restored, particularly after that summer, because the Tsar and his family were all murdered by the Bolsheviks. So if you continue to be a white and wanting a restored Russian Empire after that, it would have to be under different auspices than before. So, yes, basically that's it. Well, we've got a picture of him here with some German officers in Kiev in 1918. And then another one of him with some of his own officers. But, of course, this regime is simply a creation of the Germans. And when the Germans lose the wider war, then this state will dissolve again. And so, starting in November 1918, which was when there was an armistice in the West, German power collapses in the East, not actually quite as rapidly as one might imagine, but that's, again, another story for another day. But basically it collapses or wanes pretty rapidly. And so the Hetmanate is ousted by the Ukrainian People's Republic again, which comes back. But as you can see, just for 13 months. Now, if we look at this map, we can see the kind of trouble that the Ukrainian People's Republic is in. It's under pressure from Russian whites, from the Bolsheviks. There is also a Polish-Ukrainian war, which we considered briefly last time, which the Poles win. So, yeah, the Skoropadsky's conservative Hetmanate is overthrown, and the UPR comes back, this time with Petlura as their head of state, not simply a prominent minister in their government. And he continued to fight Bolsheviks and Russian whites, but the Bolsheviks are making these deep inroads into Ukraine, as we saw in that map a moment ago, and captured Kiev in February 1919. And as I mentioned, in the West, he's got another enemy in the Poles, as the Poles try to maximise the size of their state. And here we've got this very famous, clearly Polish nationalist painting depicting ethnic Poles fighting the Western Ukrainian army. That's another state. This story is already too complex. The sharp-eyed people among you will have seen on the map we just showed you a West Ukrainian Republic, and we're not going to pursue that one now. This story is already far too complicated. But they were fighting around Lvov, Lviv, and as we mentioned in the previous episode, that city was majority Polish. Only a small minority of Ukrainians lived there, a lot of Jews as well. But the surrounding countryside, the peasantry, were mostly Ukrainian. So that made the city, in a sense, debatable and fought over. Well, the Poles won. So our next picture shows the Red Army entering Kiev in February 1919. It changed hands 16 times between late 1918 and August 1920.
This is 16 times in less than 2 years?
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, because of all the different factions that were contending for the same kinds of pieces of territory and the rapidly shifting fortunes of war between them. I mean, if you do the math here, that means that a different army is occupying Kiev every 6 weeks or so for, 21 months, something like that. I mean, it's just madness. And must have been absolutely terrible for the people who lived there, because invading armies generally do an awful lot of damage. So, yeah, so it's changing hands between whites, reds, Ukrainian nationalists. The Poles take it at one point in coordination with Ukraine, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so in our next map we can see that the Ukrainian People's Republic has been whittled down to almost nothing. Just some area around Vinnytsia. And so we'll look now at, again, some of these changing forces of war. In December 1919, Petlura's government is forced to flee to Poland. So they're recent enemies. The following April 1920, he makes an alliance with Poland, giving up the right to Galicia, conceding He's never going to get that. That's going to be part of Poland, in exchange for help in expelling the Bolsheviks from Kiev and as much of Ukraine as can be managed. And that alliance succeeded in recapturing Kiev in May, but it held it only briefly before being forced back by the Reds almost to Warsaw. And that's a story we covered in the last episode. But that defeat brought about the prospect of any independent Ukraine that brings it to a complete end. So Petliura simply stays on in Poland, and later on he went into exile in Paris. Well, we've got a couple of pictures here from that brief victorious episode. So here are Ukrainian troops in 1920 while they're in alliance with the Poles, and during their moment of triumph in Ukraine, here's Petliura with Piłsudski, the Polish military leader in Lviv or Stanisławów, which today is called Ivano-Frankivsk. It's some way south of Lviv. I've actually travelled through that city, but only in a train. I can't say I've really seen it.
Just to clarify, this is Ukraine and Poland now allied with each other against the Reds.
Yes.
Even though not that long ago they had just been fighting against each other.
Right. This is all very pragmatic stuff, yes. And it seems to work for a while, but as we saw in the last episode, the Poles retreat even faster than they had advanced. And they're only rescued, the Poles are rescued, not the Ukrainians, by defeating the Bolsheviks outside Warsaw in August 1920. That's right. But that didn't do the Ukrainians any good. And so any attempt at a Ukrainian state is basically extinguished, as we can see in this last couple of maps, where in the first they're almost down to nothing, the second they are down to nothing. Now, one postscript to this story we should remember, and that is the whole issue of anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism we dealt with in our first series, the third, Modern Anti-Semitism, in the third episode. Please do take a look at that. But it was absolutely rife in Poland, in Ukraine, amongst Belarusians, amongst Baltic peoples, and certainly amongst Russians. And so in any conflict situation, Jewish communities are very vulnerable, and they certainly were in Petliura's independent Ukraine. Was it an anti-Semitic state? Well, the government wasn't, but loads of its functionaries were. 35,000 to 50,000 Jews were murdered in pogroms in Ukraine during the period that this republic lasted. That's absolutely appalling. It includes over 1,200 known attacks during 1918 to 21, 493 of them by the UPR's soldiers. But also their independent warlords, Denikin's White Army, one of the major players in the Russian Civil War. They killed the largest number of Jews. But there were also more than 100 attacks by Bolsheviks, who are supposed to be indifferent towards religion and have large numbers of Jews in their numbers. But still, the depth of the anti-Semitism in the society at large meant that even they were killing Jews. And also some by Polish soldiers. The UPR government pledged full legal equality for Jews. It included at least one Jewish junior minister. But Petliura didn't really have control over his own forces. So even though he threatens the death penalty for anybody taking part in pogroms, he's afraid to enforce it because he might have a rebellion on his hands. And as we've seen, he can hardly keep control even of the territory he's got, even with full support from his own forces. So that is a big issue. And in fact, it came back to haunt him years later. As we've said, he stayed in Poland, but then moved on to Paris, and he was assassinated there in 1926 while he was in exile by Shalom Schwarzbart, who was a Jewish anarchist who had lost 15 family members, including his parents, to pogroms in Odessa. Now, when he was captured and brought to trial in France, his defence was that he was avenging Jewish deaths. The prosecution denied that Petlura was responsible for Jewish deaths, which is kind of true, and they claimed that Schwarzbart was an NKVD agent. Now, the NKVD is the Soviet secret police, and he was acquitted, which is pretty gruesome, and I don't know all the details about that trial and exactly why he was acquitted. It's quite possible, of course, that Schwarzbart was an NKVD agent and an aggrieved Jewish person.
And like you said, we talk about this a lot more extensively in our first series.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that the majority of Jews in Europe are living really right in this area at the time, correct?
Right, yeah, that's the world centre of Jewry, is the western zones of what had been the Russian Empire, that's right. But that's also the world centre of anti-Semitism,
right.
For perhaps the same reason. Yes.
Right. And you'll have to forgive me because I've been thinking so much about Ukrainian history that I can't remember when exactly was the state of Israel. When did that come into being? Is that already existing
that
at
comes
this
into
point?
being in 1948, so that's way off. We are at the point that Petlura is assassinated. We are just 8 years or so into the British mandate in Palestine. And they have said that in the fullness of time they will create a national home for the Jews. And then they were hitting all kinds of problems because the locals protested about the number of Jews who were being admitted by the British, and the British were trying to slow down Jewish immigration, and so the Jews were protesting about that. So yeah, now that's all some way off. So Petlura, does he count as a hero in Ukraine today? Well, yeah, I think he does actually. Basically, simply as a Ukrainian nationalist. Okay, so to summarise this, the chaos that we've got in 1917 to 20, the last year of World War I and the 2 years after that see absolute chaos in Ukraine, including German occupation as far east as Kiev in 1917 to 18. A brief attempt at an independent Ukrainian state, the Russian civil war between Bolsheviks, communists, and whites, everyone else, and a Polish-Soviet war in which the Soviet Red Army tried and failed to annex the newly recreated Polish state that had been set up by the Paris Peace Treaty at the end of World War I. So all of this is going on within the compass of a few years. And at the end of all the fighting, we have a situation in which the centre and east of Ukraine were included in the Soviet Union well, it's not called the Soviet Union until 1922, but what's becoming the Soviet Union, and that's the area in pink and brown shading. And the western part was part of the newly created Poland in purple. But the ethnicities in Poland, and particularly in the eastern areas that the Poles called Kresy, were mixed, and relations between Poles and Ukrainians were often not good.
So, totally different circumstances, but for Western Ukraine at least, the same basic division as before World War I, with the center and the east under Russian rule, and the west is under a Western power.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Austro-Hungary before the war, Poland after. But it's the same general division. And that counts for today, in terms of what we've said in previous episodes, that people living in Western Ukraine until after the Second World War see themselves as nothing to do with Russia, that they see themselves as part of the West. Whereas in the centre and the east of the country, it's a different story. And experiences of Russian rule are, let's say, significantly longer. They don't go back forever, but significantly longer, yeah. Okay, well, we've now got a map showing interwar Poland and the ethnicities in it, according to a Polish academic. So the areas in red are inhabited predominantly by Poles. Those in brown, predominantly by Ukrainians, and in grey by Belarusians. Although many Belarusians actually didn't even call themselves Belarusians at the time. They often called themselves simply locals. Theirs was one of the last national consciousnesses to emerge in Europe, at least. So they're still talking, a lot of them, in the old-fashioned way.
And you always like to say about these kinds of maps that they're absolutely necessary and absolutely misleading.
Yes. It's a strange situation. I mean, they're so helpful in giving us a general idea of what's going on, but always you need to bear in mind that many areas would have had no absolute majority. But the poor old map maker has got to colour every bit of it something or other. So they're giving. As long as we take it at the level of being impressionistically true, then these are very helpful. But you can't get too dogmatic about them. And anybody with much experience of the Balkans will know that the same thing applies a fortiori here. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Okay, well, we're going to move on now to focus particularly on the east and centre of Ukraine that ended up under Soviet control. That is, well, not just Soviet control, part of the Soviet Union, as it's declared to be from 1922. So maybe the best way to come at this is to get an overview of that interwar period in the Soviet Union, and then we'll focus down on the tragedy that hits Soviet Ukraine. So the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 21 cost around 10 million lives, but the Reds in the end won it. Now 10 million is a gigantic number. That is almost as many people as died in the whole of World War One on all sides. Right? This is not a relatively small war. It's massive. Lenin died in 1924, and there was then a power struggle for about 3 years between various of his deputies, and we won't go into that. That's another big story. It sees Stalin emerge victorious, and he's in power, sole power then, from 1927 down to his death in 1953. He decided upon two key policies: a crash industrialization program to catch up with the West, and collectivization of the farms.
Yeah, what in practice does collectivization of the farms mean, and why did Stalin want to do it?
Right. Well, we need to remember that in the minds of communists, they see themselves as bringing about the dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat is communist speak for the industrial working class. So, whilst they want to say that they're also on the side of the peasants, they see the peasants as a nuisance, as a remnant of the old world, and they see them as existing simply to provide the proletariat, the urban workers, with food. They're people then to be humoured, but finally to be used. Now, at first, what happens is that the great land holdings of the aristocracy are taken away from the aristocrats and given to the peasants. So peasants are very happy. This is one of the things they'd wanted for a long time. But the danger of that, from a communist point of view, is that you've simply created a whole generation of millions and millions of potential small-scale capitalists. So you want to nip that in the bud. You don't want it to last too long. And so Stalin says what we want is to collectivise the farms, and this is more modern, he says. It means you'll have larger farms, you'll get economies of scale. The communists thought they understood the Western economic concept of economies of scale, but they didn't actually. No, I'm going to go down a rabbit trail here. I'm not going to pursue that one. They thought, let's just say, they thought they understood it, but they didn't. So if you have large farms, then you can justify bringing in modern equipment, modern machinery, modern farming methods, bigger fields, and so on, and that will increase food production. The downside is that if nobody's an owner of the farm, just the state, then you simply demotivate the farmers, the peasants, from generating all that food. You're basically taking their property and their livestock away from them. And so what the collectivization does is leads to a collapse in food production, and so to famine in the early 1930s, in which perhaps 5 million people died, especially in Soviet Ukraine. And we should mention, before we get on to that collectivization, which we are going to do right now, also the purges of Communist Party members in the late 1930s, in which lots of loyal communists were killed, because, of course, socialism doesn't work. A communist government can never admit that. And so any failures must be the result of people conspiring against us. It must be a result of sabotage. And so we will accuse loads of people of secretly sabotaging the system and being Western agents and this kind of thing. So loads of managers and engineers and people like this found themselves sent to the Gulag, simply executed, and forced to accuse themselves under pain of having their families executed if they failed to do so. So that led to another, 150,000 deaths, something like that. I mean, a huge number of people, but relatively small compared to what we're about to look at now.
And this is probably why communism is sort of known for, the idea of spying on your neighbor. Everybody's kind of keeping tabs on everybody else, because if you're being a little bit selfish, then the whole system is at stake.
Yes, that's right. Communists actually, like fascists, really, but the communists were more extreme on this, hated and feared private life. Right? The ideal was that everybody should live their life in the public sphere. So they did build whole loads of new housing, to be entirely fair, but in cities, because they wanted people to become urban workers, not workers in the countryside. But loads of these apartments were not private at all. They were living in collective apartments in which neighbours could spy on one another, and they could always find someone who would come into the pay of the secret services to keep an eye on all of the people they were living with, this kind of thing, and to keep people busy in out-of-work organisations, political organisations, sports clubs, parades, all this kind of stuff. So the home wasn't seen as, wasn't intended to be seen as some kind of a refuge. Yes.
How does a theory, an idea like this, I mean, if everybody, like you said, is supposed to be, participating in what's going on, why is it that the proletariat and the people in the cities are sort of in a more favored position, and why are the peasants, seen as somebody that is not as good, if everybody's supposed to be equal?
Right. Well, the whole system was riddled with inconsistencies. I mean, perhaps we could say not necessarily the worse on that account, because all societies, are riddled with inconsistencies, and should be. But this is a modernist ideology which claims to have tapped everything down, and mapped everything out quite clearly on the basis of several unalterable principles. So it didn't like the idea of inconsistency, but in fact it was extremely inconsistent. Yes. And certainly the top communist officials lived way more comfortable lives than everybody else. So it was not an equal society really in any sense.
Yeah, and we're really about to get into
we're going to get
how that played out.
We're going to get into the agricultural side of that. When we do a history of Russia, which we will at some point, we'll look into the kind of aspects that you're putting your finger on there, yes. But we'll just leave it at that for now. So, okay, we've got a couple of propaganda posters here for the collective farm. So this is showing going off to work on the collective farm, and the next one working on the kolkhoz is like a conflation of a couple of Russian words, means basically collective farm.
And it's always bright and sunny out there on the farm during harvest time.
Yes, it's always harvest time, you would think, from the posters, and there's so many tractors you could hardly believe it. Of course there were very, very few tractors, but these were starting to be produced as part of the campaign for modernisation. But because of course no market principles were allowed to work, everything was done by command from the centre, you get low quality products in everything. That you can take that for granted, and the tractors that are produced may not have all their working parts, or if they break down, there isn't a supply chain of parts to repair them. There may not be enough petrol, and so on. And I mentioned a moment ago, when I was tempted to go off track a little in talking about the economies of scale, all factory production for the entire Soviet Union was centered on one vast plant at Chelyabinsk. Now, an economist will tell you that economies of scale work until you get to too big a size. And at that point, diseconomies of scale start, because everything has to be transported over huge distances, or the costs of labour go up because you've got too many people needed in too small an area, this kind of thing. But if you're running a command economy, you don't pay any attention to that. So yeah, they're all produced in Chelyabinsk, and they don't necessarily even work. But they are trying to modernise, and so tractors are very prominent in propaganda posters in the Soviet Union. Anything to do with agriculture, we are the modernisers, we're the way of the future. But this horrible picture underneath, for which I apologise, shows the reality: famine deaths in the Ukraine in the early 1930s. This horrible episode that is known in Ukrainian as the Holodomor, or the starving, the hunger. What actually happened was that lots of peasants, if they knew their livestock was going to be taken away from them, decided simply to kill it all and eat it in one huge feast before they lost it forever. So the amount of livestock for various key animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, and so on, chickens, collapsed in the Soviet Union during this period because of this understandable behaviour. But also there were grain requisitions demanded from each collective farm. But because grain output collapsed as well, what the communist authorities did was to come in and take away the requisition even from the enormously diminished crop, leaving the peasants with practically nothing. And so that meant that they were the ones especially who starved. In the cities they were generally better off, although as you can see from this next picture, these are people falling down dead in a major city like Kharkiv. Kharkiv in northeast Ukraine, as we know, just over the last few weeks there's fighting around that city again with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Fortunately not yet in it, but they are bombarding it. Okay, so that's where this is happening. And people just walking on by.
The reason that the majority of deaths are happening in Ukraine is because that's where the majority of peasants live. Is that right?
No, but they are especially concentrated there, and it is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Now, the exact reasons for this we'll come to in a moment, because it's a rather hot debate. But we'll get to this in just a moment. Let's just get the other side of this picture here. So this is, again, I'm afraid, another horrible picture of people starving to death. It's an entirely man-made famine. Statistics are debated, but it seems the safest bet is that about 5 million people died, and 3.9 million of those are in Soviet Ukraine. Now, there's been a lot of books brought out about this, including some even before the end of the Cold War. But the most important and best-selling one of recent years has been by Anne Applebaum. Now, my phraseology here is a little unfortunate. It kind of implies that she's Ukrainian. She's not. She's an American married to a Pole. But her best-selling book, Red Famine, the subtitle is Stalin's War on Ukraine. And so she is arguing, as Ukrainian historians argue, that the collectivization famine was deliberately directed at crushing Ukraine and its national identity. Now, it's tempting to want to argue that way. It could also be argued that this was simply a horrible, utterly heartless, wicked program of the communists, and the blow fell mostly on Ukraine because it was the breadbasket. Although it's hard to avoid the conclusion that actually if this crushed or punished people who the communist authorities might have seen as guilty of Ukrainian nationalism, they were not exactly displeased. But certainly her argument would be that this was quite deliberately focused on Ukraine. Okay, so we're going to spend a little time now talking about one of the few heroes of this horrible, horrible episode, and it's this man Gareth Jones. His name has been waved around again quite a lot in recent years, as we'll see in a moment. He was a Welsh journalist who went to Moscow and managed to get out of Moscow. You weren't supposed to leave, and get out into the countryside to find out what was going on. And he reported back, Russia today is in the grip of famine, which is proving as disastrous as the catastrophe of 1921, when millions died. He's referring back to the famine on the Volga in the later stages of the Russian Civil War, which had killed millions of people as well. Said Mr. Gareth Jones, formerly political secretary of Mr. Lloyd George, the British World War I leader, Prime Minister. He's reporting this after a long walking trip through the Ukraine and other districts of the Soviet Union. In an interview with the New York Evening Post, Mr. Jones said that famine on a colossal scale was impending. In a train, a communist denied to me that there was a famine. I flung into the spittoon a crust of bread I'd been eating from my own supply. A peasant, my fellow passenger, fished it out and ravenously ate it. I threw orange peel into the spittoon. The peasant again grabbed and devoured it. The communist subsided. The peasants were eating the cattle fodder. They told me that many had already died of hunger. 2 soldiers came to arrest a thief. They warned me against travel by night, as there were too many starving, desperate men. We are waiting for death, was my welcome. But see, we still have our cattle fodder. Go farther south, there they have nothing. Many houses are empty of people already dead, they cried. After Stalin, the most hated man in Russia is Bernard Shaw. Now that is a reference to George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, who went to Moscow, came back, was asked about the rumours of famine in Russia, and said, famine in Russia? I never ate so well as when I was in Moscow. He was, like many of the Western intellectual classes, a sympathiser with the Bolsheviks. And of course, if some great figure like that is allowing himself to be gulled so easily by the Soviet authorities, that just fills the rest of the population with despair, that not even the outside world is noticing them or even believes that they are suffering. To many of those who can read and have read his descriptions of plentiful food supply in their starving land, the future is blacker than the present. There's insufficient seed. Many of the peasants are too weak to work the land. The new taxation policy, which promised to take only a fixed amount of grain from the peasants, will fail to encourage production because the peasants refuse to trust the government. What he's saying is that if the peasants did trust the government, that the government would only take a fixed amount of the grain, they'd produce more because they'd have all the surplus. But they don't believe it. And why don't they believe it? Because of their experience, that you can't believe a word the government tells them. Now, he was a Cambridge-educated Welsh journalist. You can see he lives to, well, he's not quite 30, he's murdered just short of his 30th birthday. He was the first to report the Soviet famine, and his news was unwelcome to Western intellectuals who looked on what was happening in the Soviet Union as a kind of brave experiment and perhaps the way of the future. And he was discredited and belittled most famously by the New York Times' Walter Duranty. Although he's a reporter for the New York Times, Walter Duranty was another Brit and an utterly despicable character. So, but there were many people who were prepared, as it were, to disbelieve him. But of course, events proved him right. This memorial plaque was put up to Gareth Jones in 2006, and it's in English and Welsh and Ukrainian. A couple of years later, he was on a trip to Manchuria in northeast China, and he was captured by bandits who killed him 2 weeks after that. And it's widely suspected that it was an act of revenge by the NKVD. Now, there are a number of books out about him. There's this recent biography on the left here that you can see. And back 5 years ago, a movie appeared, Mr. Jones, which is... You know, I hate historical movies because they always distort the past, and certainly this one does. They have him meeting the young George Orwell, which he didn't, and romanticising the actual events quite a bit. But it certainly gives you the kind of flavour of what happened.
We've actually watched this movie together, and it really is. It's a well done movie. And it's very fascinating. Although I don't think my mother has ever forgiven you for having her sit through that. And so, just as a warning to everybody out there, there are some very disturbing scenes that may stick with you for quite a while. Yes. Just as a disclaimer.
Yes. I don't think we have reason to believe that he actually personally witnessed cannibalism, but cannibalism there certainly was. But an incident like that is portrayed in the movie. Yes, it's certainly gut-wrenching stuff. Yeah.
I think the craziest part of his story is, like you said, nobody in the West, in America or the UK, really believed what he was saying. And that's just because the Soviets were doing such a great job of covering it up. I mean, how is it that nobody really knew about this?
Yeah, it's one of these questions that's a bit like, how much did ordinary Germans know about the Holocaust? You know,
Right.
People had a sense that something awful was happening, and if you wanted to know, you certainly could know. And an awful lot of people were closing their eyes. Yeah. Maybe the analogy I just made there is not quite right, and I beg nobody to get offended by it. But it's the same kind of dynamic. People closing their eyes, or simply choosing not to look too closely at what's going on because they don't want to. Yes.
Right.
I mean, the Soviets were making it... right down to the end of the Soviet Union, they made it difficult to travel to the Soviet Union, and there were only certain areas you were allowed to go to. You couldn't simply travel as you wanted, although the impression was given that that was not the case, but in fact it was. And certainly the Western journalists were all corralled into Hotel Metropole in Moscow. Things were pretty tightly controlled.
Do we know the reason why Gareth Jones in particular started this investigation? I'm sure they said so in the movie, but it's been a little while.
Well, he certainly spoke good Russian. He'd studied, if I remember correctly, I think he's a native Welsh speaker, so he speaks Welsh and English like native standard, and he studied, I think, German and Russian in Cambridge. So he had taken an interest in all things Russian. So he was pretty well placed to go. I mean, just to go back a little bit in this conversation, one of the reasons why his news was not well received was it broke just at the time that Hitler was coming to power in Germany. And so loads of people felt, well, look, this is the principal danger facing us now. We don't want to start making an utter enemy of the Soviet Union. Even though, I mean, British-Soviet relations were absolutely terrible anyway. They were worse than American-Soviet relations all the way through the interwar period. So, but a lot of people didn't want to exacerbate that even more. This topic has been the subject of a number of recent art productions, and we've got here a painting by Ukrainian artist Nina Marchenko, portraying, dead bodies being taken away on wagons during the Holodomor. What we've got here is communists attacking a parade of Ukrainians in Chicago in 1933.
So these are Ukrainian immigrants in Chicago protesting about what Stalin is doing back home, and then local communists attacking them for what, blowing the whistle?
Yes, that's exactly it. And the fact that these Ukrainians are protesting shows that if you wanted to know, you could know. Right? You could know. So yeah, that indicates exactly the kind of dynamic that's going on here. Yes. Now, what we've got next, and we're nearly at an end now, is a propaganda photo, not a propaganda poster, but a photo by Semyon Friedland, the sixth day on the Waldheim collective farm, and so they're all having a dance. So the message being that life on the collective farm is absolutely wonderful. You know, people are starving? Well, of course not. No, they're having a great old time. Friedland went on to have a long career as a photo propagandist. So in the 1950s and 60s, working for the magazine Ogonyok, he produced loads of very upbeat photos, supposedly of normal Soviet life, but always painting things in very roseate hues. But what he was doing was presenting to people within the Soviet Union what they were supposed to believe life was like around them. And of course, because their own lives were so miserable, therefore to conclude that they themselves were the exception, that life at large was great. Well, we'll finish with a very dark joke. There were plenty of jokes going around in the totalitarian societies, certainly in the communist ones, for which you could be in very severe trouble. So two skeletons meet on the streets of Kiev. "Hey," says one, "when did you die?" "In 1932, in the Great Famine," the other replies. "How about you?" "Oh, I'm still alive, thank God." It's a skeleton, but still alive. "Shh! Don't you know that nowadays you can't thank God? You must thank Stalin." "And what shall I do when he dies?" "Then you can thank God." Pretty dark stuff, that.
Oh. Anybody following on Facebook, or anybody following you in particular on Facebook, will know that this is unfortunately your kind of humor.
I'm afraid so, yeah. I've been immersed in this kind of stuff for too long. I'm terrible at remembering jokes. Most of the jokes I can remember are from the 1990s and early 2000s in the Balkans, political jokes. And we don't get these kind of jokes anymore, which is sad, but those were the bad old days. The reason we don't have the jokes is because the politics is not that horrifying. So yeah, the only joke, if anybody says, "Tell us a good joke, Mike," the only ones I can remember are ones that are refer to events that the person listening won't remember and are way out of date. But yeah, there are loads of these kinds of jokes going on in the Soviet Union, and at some stage, I seem to be saying this every 3 minutes. We will probably include a whole load more of them in some future episode under some rubric or other. We'll try and do that. Perhaps when we do Russian history, there's a whole load more communist era jokes. Yeah. But until then, goodbye everybody, and thank you for staying with us. And please do, if you like this episode, remember to repost it on social media. And if you didn't like this episode, repost it on social media and tell all your friends how much you hated it and why.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think just to mention here too, really the reason, at least for me, that I got into this, and really I know for you too, is that it's just very important to you and I for people to be educated, especially because of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine right now, and not just that situation, but it is important to understand these things so that you can understand what's going on in the world around us right now. So
right, yes. If one doesn't know these things, then one doesn't really understand what's going on in Ukraine at the moment and what's motivating particularly Ukrainians, but also certain kinds of Russian arguments and so on. Because this is what we're saying is common knowledge. Well, it is common knowledge, but it's all disputed, of course, by various parties. So, yeah. But that's the material that's very much in their minds. And when we get to the final episode of this series, or maybe just before that, we're going to take a look at We're going to revisit a whole load of episodes running right through the seam of history that we've been following, showing what Soviets say about it, what Russian nationalists say about it, what Ukrainians say about it, and so on. Yeah, it really matters.
Yeah. So we encourage you, share with your friends. It's good for people to be educated.
Yep. Thank you very much for being with us, everybody, and we'll see you next week.